Okay, it's 3 o'clock. I got the air monitor back on again. As long as it's green, it's fine. So, last week I talked about value, what it is, types of value, why you would want to put a monetary value on environmental goods and services. And this week and next, I'm going to talk about how to do it. And today I'm going to start with a number of methods that together come under the name of the field preference methods that are fairly robust, but also fairly limited in its scope and application. And then next week I'm going to talk about methods that are more comprehensive and you can do more things with them, but that comes at the price of all sorts of biases. So this is where we are. I'm going to talk about revealed preferences today, and then next week I'm going to complete the sequence on valuation, and after that we're going to talk about instruments, policy instruments. So essentially what you do in revealed preference methods, it helps if I just make it bigger. Essentially what you do in revealed preference methods is that you infer preferences for environmental goods or environmental services by analyzing the behavior in real markets, in related markets, in surrogate markets, in hypothetical markets. It comes in all sorts of different ways, but perhaps the best term there is the surrogate market. And there's 3 kinds of these surrogate markets. First, the environment and whatever market you're looking at may be substitutes. So you may derive utility either directly from the environment or from something that is bought and sold on the market. And one example may be bottled water. This is something you don't get for free, versus water that you just scoop out of a stream and drink, right, which comes for free. And it used to be that our stomachs were pretty tough and natural waters were pretty clean, so why would you buy bottled water? Nowadays there is a big industry to provide clean and supposedly tasty, or at least not foul tasting water to you, right? And this tells you something about the price that people are willing to pay for different types of water. Tells you something about how much they would have liked to drink pristine water from the stream were that still feasible, right? And this group of methods, or the methods that use this particular relationship, are often called defensive expenditure or avertive behavior, or sometimes substitute markets, right? So that is one way of deriving the value of the environment. It may also be that the environment and the market, the related market that you're looking at, are really complements. And one example, and these are George's lectures, so I actually don't know where this picture was taken. But suppose you want to go and enjoy that particular landscape, and essentially you would need to drive there. And if you own a car, you would need to pay for the petrol. If you don't own a car, you may also need to pay for the car rent, right? Or pay a taxi or something. And again, that tells you something about the value of this particular landscape. If people are prepared to make that expense, that yes, they must somehow like this, right? And the expense that they make is an indicator of how much they like things. And this is typically referred to as the travel cost method. So that is the second approach here. And the third approach is that some things you can only buy in bundles. That is, if you buy, in this case, a house, you don't just buy the house, but you also buy the location in which the house is situated, including everything that comes with that house, right? And it may be sitting near a wheat field, and if you're Theresa May, you would like to run in that field, right? The methods that use this particular approach are typically referred to as hedonic pricing or hedonic wage studies, where wage is of course the price of labor. Right, so those are the high-level principles. The good thing about these revealed preference methods is that you're looking at the actual behavior of real people in real situations. Next week we're going to talk about stated preference methods. And that essentially surveys people and asks them, how much do you think it's worth? And the big problem there is that they may not know, or they may not want to tell you the truth, right? But this is based on real expenditure of real people in real situations, right? People have put the money where their mouth is. These studies are relatively cheap. This is sort of the stuff that a PhD student can do in a year, right? So with a bit of data collection and everything, you come at 100K or so. And oftentimes you can use administrative data, so you don't have to do the data collection yourself. You can just use existing data. For instance, if you're interested in the price of houses, then you can talk to a real estate agent and get their databases, or you can scrape the web, what are they called, Supla, and those other sites that the name of which I completely forget at the moment, and you can just get these data, or you can go to the land registry if you're in the UK and just download the price of every house that was sold on this in this country for the last 10 years, including the exact location of that house, right? So that data is just available. You don't need to collect the data yourself, and that makes it a relatively cheap method for estimating these things. The main weakness of revealed preference methods is that you can only estimate the use values. People buy a house to live there. They don't buy a house because elephants exist, right? You just can't derive existence value of elephants from the housing market because it's completely unrelated. Nor would you be able to derive bequest values, because people buy a house not because they want the landscape around that house to go to their children. You buy a house and you plan to resell it at some point, or if you leave it to your children, chances are they will sell it. So there's no bequest value there, or anything, or stuff like that. So that is its main drawback. If you're looking at market data and you want to interpret market data, then you need to know what the market is like, and that is relatively easy if the market is perfect and everybody's a price taker. But if somehow people have market power, then you need to be much more careful in how you interpret price signals, right? And of course, as I said before the break, this works at the margin. This works for relatively small changes in the environment or in the market, or for incomes for that matter. It does not work for large changes. So that's the general overview. What I'm going to do next is take you through these three methods, put more structure on it and how you really do it, and then show you a case study for all three. And I'm going to start with defensive expenditure. And what you see here is a cyclist who clearly has an air filter in his mouth, right? Because he does not like the particulates and other stuff that comes out of the cars that he's cycling past. This obviously paid for this, right? And it's presumably not, I don't cycle like this, presumably it's not very pleasant to wear. So he must really dislike the air pollution on the road. And that is essentially what you do. And I mean, the defensive expenditure method or the averted behavior or the substitute market method is fairly straightforward, right? So you look at the price of bottled water, and you need to figure out why do people drink bottled water. And if you ask them and they tell you it is because I don't want to get ill, and that is the only reason I drink bottled water, then you can derive from that purchase how much they are willing to pay to avoid getting ill, right? But of course it may also be that they buy bottled water because they don't like the taste of tap water, because it's chlorinated or something. And it may be that they're buying bottled water for a mix of reasons. They think there's something wrong with the tap water, it makes you ill, but it also doesn't taste very nice, and it may be trendy to drink a particular type of water, right? It's perhaps not true for bottled water per se, but nowadays you have all these sort of bottles where they say this water is flavored, but it isn't really, or it has certain stuff in, particularly vague whether that really works and whether it's really in there. And people are prepared to pay for that, right? So it may sound simple that you say, oh, I'm just going to estimate a demand function for bottled water, but you need to know what people buy this for in order to make it work, right? To shed light on what you're trying to estimate. And of course, what you need to do there is essentially get into people's mental models, right? Suppose that people do drink bottled water only for health reasons and not for aesthetic reasons or for being popular or for taste or whatever. They just do it to avoid illness. Then of course you cannot derive their value for avoiding getting sick from epidemiological data. You cannot go to the ONS and say, so how many people die of this illness that drinking bottled water would avoid you to get, right? Am I still speaking English? That doesn't work. What matters there is what do the people who buy this think the probability of avoiding an illness is. Not what is the objective probability, but what is the subjective probability, right? So this may sound easy, but it is in fact a bit more complicated. You can also look at double glazing, right? That mitigates noise, but also again keeps the heat in. So it's a dual purpose type of action. And then you need to attribute somehow how much are they willing to pay for avoiding the noise and how much are they willing to pay to reduce their energy bills and save on CO2 emissions. Similarly for cycle helmets, it's a bit simpler. Cycle helmets have a single purpose, right? They make you look silly. Or as people will tell you, they actually prevent injury. Now, I've cycled a lot in my life, and I've fallen off my bike a lot of times. I've never fallen on my head, right? I don't think cycle helmets do anything useful. But that's my opinion, right? And it's, I think, illegal in this country to cycle without one. So don't believe me. So let's look at a case study. I'll go through this relatively quickly. The other two are more interesting and exciting, I think. So this is a study that was done by Laughlin, I think, in 1993. It's here in Pennsylvania, in Milesburg, and it is about Giardia contamination. Now, Giardia is something that you want to avoid. It's sort of this little bacterium that swims in water. It is, if you get it, it's absolutely bad for you. Really violent diarrhea, fever, cramps, nausea. You really want to avoid this, right? It makes you really, really sick. This is one of those things that your grandparents or perhaps your great-grandparents could drink Giardia contaminated water, no problem, right? But your stomach can't handle it, right? So avoid it if you can. And it's basically everywhere in the water, right? So what do you do, right? There's Giardia in the water. What can you do? Well, essentially, you need to clean the water or find an alternative source of drinking water. And then the question is, what would that cost? And what this study did is they surveyed residents and asked them, so what did you do? There was a health warning out. They switched to bottled water. They put on filters. They hauled water in from long distance, and so on and so forth. And some just didn't do anything. And the analysis of what did it cost is essentially how much did they pay for the alternative, what is the energy that they spent on this, if they, for instance, started to boil water or bought some sort of filter that needed electricity, if they went to the neighboring village or the neighboring town to get water, as the guy on the motorbike there is doing, how much did they spend on fuel, and then of course if you're driving up and down the country to get clean water, what is the opportunity cost of time. Now this is Pennsylvania, a relatively large, a relatively rich part of the world, and it turned out that the results were completely and utterly driven by what do you assume about the opportunity cost of time. And that essentially drove the results. And what you see here is that the total costs of the averted behavior of trying to avoid Giardia runs to 45,000 for around 450 households. So that's $100 per household, right? If you sort of like set it at the mid-range of the income range in this part of the world, then the total value is 45,000, right? If you ignore the opportunity cost of time, then it goes down to zero. It goes down to 8,000, right? So the big element in this particular case study, in this particular cost estimate, is what is the value of time. And then of course it also becomes a question of, so who did this, right? If you send out, and that's the photo here, and I don't think this is Pennsylvania at all. If you send out a guy in prime working age to get the water, then it is expensive, right? If you send out somebody with very low skills, then it is not nearly as expensive, right? Or if you send out somebody who is unemployed, then it's not nearly as expensive, right? And that of course makes this, and if the wage cost is the main driver of your total estimates, then it's very important to figure out, so who actually did this activity and what is the value of their time. Not what is the average value of time, but what is the value of the time of people who actually do this. And then of course you can get into power structures and those sort of things within families. If you were to do this study in any developing country, you would find that the women of the family are doing this, right? With all the implications from that. So it may seem simple, right? But it's not in practice, right? And you need to be careful how to do it. The other limitations, one is that the mitigation is typically incomplete. For instance, double glazing stops some of the noise but not all of the noise, and it helps in your house but not in your garden. It is an underestimate, right? What you get is the minimum willingness to pay for these things, but not anything about the consumer surplus, so you need to estimate the demand function. And it is hard to identify all defensive behaviors. And some people may be doing multiple things, or maybe doing different things at different times of the day, right? They may boil their water while they're in their home, but buy water when they're going shopping or something, to drink while they're going shopping, right? Obviously, they went shopping when they bought the water. And there may be behavioral adaptations as well. That is, they may exercise less so that the demand for water falls and things like that, and all that needs to be included in order to get to a complete estimate, right? I talked about the joint products. I did not talk about the beer or the ale for that matter. One of the reasons that in olden times people used to drink so much ale was essentially because the water was unsafe to drink, right? Not because they wanted to get drunk or something, or because the ale in those days tasted very well. That was essentially because the water was too dangerous to drink. And somebody called drink water does not have a funny name, but it's an indicator that this was a very poor person, or the descendant of a very poor person who could not afford to buy ale, right? In those days. Okay, the travel cost method can be used to, has been used to estimate particularly tourism, but also forms of recreation. So you see here, that must be Bali or something. There's elephants out there, let's say that's in Canada. There's mountain landscapes, there's coral reefs, there's fishing, and there's of course just your the park down the road, right? The travel cost method is actually the oldest of these methods, and it was first proposed in 1947 by Harold Hotelling. Now, we all know it was Harold Hotelling, right? He is the guy who gave you the first welfare pyramid. And he wrote to, in 1947, he actually put the entire method in a letter to the director of the National Park Service. He refers to an older study that was done a century before by his French engineers, Hluhluwe. And this is what he writes, right? I am convinced that it's possible to set up appropriate measures for evaluating with a reasonable degree of accuracy the service of national parks to the public. Blah, blah, blah. One of these of which the feasibility I am confident which might be pursued further is as follows. So here he goes and proposes his method. Let concentric zones be defined around each park, and he writes to the director of the National Park Service, right? So these are big natural parks in the US, not the park around the corner, so that the cost of travel to the park from all points in one of these zones is approximately constant. Persons entering the park in a year, or a suitably chosen sample of them, are to be listed according to the zones from which they come. The fact that they come means that their service of the park is at least worth the cost, and this cost can probably be estimated with fair accuracy. If we assume that the benefits are the same no matter what the distance, we have, for those living near the park, a consumer surplus consisting of the differences in transportation costs. Comparison of the costs coming from a zone with the number of people who come from it, together with a count of the population of the zone, enables us to plot 1 point for each zone on the demand curve for the service of the park. By a judicious choice of fitting, it should be possible to get a good enough approximation to this demand curve to provide, through integration, a measure of the consumer surplus resulting from the availability of the park. It is this consumer surplus which measures the benefits to the public in that particular year. This, of course, might be capitalized to give the capital value of the park, or the annual measure of benefit might be compared directly with the estimated annual benefits on the hypothesis that the park area was used for some alternate purpose. And that's the travel cost method, right? Again, the principles are very simple. So simple that Hotelling could write it up in essentially one paragraph. So what you do is you use the effort that people make to get to a place, and you use that as an estimate of their willingness to pay to get there. So if you go to the cinema, you pay an entrance fee, right? £8 or so to go see a movie. The fact that you are willing to pay those £8 means that, at least in anticipation, you think that the movie you're going to see is worth more than £8, right? If you go to the beach, you don't pay an entrance fee. But, unless you live on the beach, you do spend money to get there, and you definitely spend time to get there. So essentially you pay an entrance fee. And if you need to take the bus to get to the beach, and the bus fare is £2.40 for a single and £4.80 for a return, and you have paid that bus for that bus ticket, that means that you think that visiting the beach is worth at least £4.80, right? That is the travel cost method. And you can use it in essentially valuing sites. And of course it's much more interesting to value changes in size. If they open a park or close a park, if they cut down the trees or plant new trees, if they put big grazers on or something like that, or they put a fence around it, that is the sort of things that you're interested in rather than its total value. And this can be done for single sites or for multiple sites, and it can be done through zonal methods or individual methods. And you can look at a number of trips and so on and so forth. And of course what Hotelling did was use zones, right? And then if you want to look at multiple sites, then you need slightly more advanced econometric methods that I'll talk about as well. So how does this work in theory? So we have an economic agent who wants to maximize utility U, and utility is a function of consumption good X and recreation R, where R here is seen as the number of visits. and this is subject to a monetary budget, where W is the wage earned and TW is the amount of time spent working, so that is your income. And then that money can be spent, and it's a one period model, so we do away with investments. That can be spent on good X that has a price of 1 by assumption, and you can spend it on getting to the recreation site at a cost of C per trip, right? So that is your money budget. And then is your time budget, and the assumption is that you do one of two things: either you work or you spend your time on this site enjoying yourself. And there is an error in the subscript there. That is, of course, R times TR, not R times TW, otherwise it doesn't make any sense. So that is what you do. Let's take the budget constraints to the next step. And let's do so. The budget constraint is at the very top. The money budget constraint is at the very top. The time budget constraint is your second line. We talked about these equations before, and the typo is still there. And let's just define the price per trip as P, and that is of course equal to C, that is the amount of money you spend there, and then the time equivalent WTR. You can bring WTR to the other side of the equation and multiply everything with R, and then you get the fourth equation that you see there. PR minus WRTR is equal to CR. And we had CR in the top equation, right? So we can substitute that in, and then we have that the budget constraint in money is your income times the total price of your recreation minus the wage times the time spent recreating plus whatever you consume. That doesn't work. Whatever you consume in the other good, right? But we of course also know that TW plus R times TR, that's your time budget, is equal to T. So we can rework that equation with the four terms in, bring WRTR to the other side of the equation, then we have TW plus R times TW is equal to T, so the equation simplifies to WT is PR plus X. And essentially what we've done there is we combined the money constraint, the budget constraint on money, and the budget constraint on time, and combine them into a single budget constraint. And what you see there, that makes the optimization a lot easier. So we want to maximize utility, subject to the constraint that WT is equal to PR plus X. You form the Lagrangian, you see there, introduce the Lagrange multiplier lambda, and you have your first order condition that U or that du dr is equal to lambda p, and du dx is equal to lambda times 1, because we normalize the price of the consumption good to 1, and we just have our marginal rate of substitution, right? The lambda drops out if you take the ratio of these two things. And what we have is that in the equilibrium, the marginal or the ratio of marginal utilities is equal to the ratio of prices. So recreation is just an ordinary good, right? There's nothing special that went on here. This is good, right? We can just do a demand curve. You can just integrate under the demand curve. What is here not denoted as a willingness to pay curve is just an ordinary demand curve, right? If the price is high, the number of trips is low, and if the price is low, the number of trips is high. Right? So going back to the example of the beach, if you were to go to Brighton Beach, preferably at a time when the weather is nicer and there's more light than there is now, and you would ask people, where are you from? And how much time and money did you spend to come here? You would find that there's a lot of people who live in Brighton, and there's actually a lot of people who live just a few blocks from the beach who are there. You would find people who traveled further, right, who may have traveled from Eastbourne or from Lewis or from East Grinstead to go to the beach in Brighton, but they would be relatively few. And chances are you may meet an Australian, but if you ask the Australian, why are you here? The answer would not be because I really wanted to see Brighton Beach, right? They may be in the UK for family reasons or for work or whatever, and just chucked in a trip to Brighton Beach. But this is not the primary purpose of why they were there, right? Very unlikely. Whereas if you go to Australia and you go to the Great Barrier Reef and you interview people, where are you from and why are you here? Chances are there is somebody from Brighton even who flew especially to Australia to go see the Great Barrier Reef, right? But still you would find more locals, right? Because 24 hours in the plane, 3, 4, 5,000 pounds in travel cost is quite something. The Great Barrier Reef is probably worth it, but if you live close by, then you would go often, right? For you guys it's probably a once in a lifetime experience, but if you live in Queensland, then it's something you probably do every weekend, right? So two things, right? One, yes, this is downward sloping. The people who have to make little effort to get to the thing that you're interested in, you see a lot of them, and you see very few of those who have to make a large effort. So that is one thing. But also you immediately note that some things are really worth a lot, and we are prepared to spend weeks to get there, and we are prepared to spend thousands of pounds to get there, right? So yes, this tells you something about the value of these particular environmental goods or services. Now, if we have a demand curve, we have a consumer surplus, right, which is just the triangle, almost triangle, the area under the curve, right? And that tells you something about how much how much the value of something would change if it's in this case completely abolished, right? There is a key assumption here, right? So the travel cost method, if we use it to value, say, Brighton Beach, and we want to know the value of Brighton Beach, and we want to know the consumer surplus that it generates, what you do is you compare the current situation, say 10 trips, to the situation where there's 0 trips. And we assume that there are 0 trips because it's not there, right? And that tells us something about the total value. Which immediately implies that we deny the existence value, right? This is strictly about use values. Because from a use value perspective, if you're not going there, then it might as well not be there. Right? That's the same thing. So this is strictly for a use value. Now, you may attach an existence value to Brighton Beach, but it's not particularly special, right? There's single beaches everywhere. Now, hoteling described the so-called zonal travel cost method. So essentially what you do is you have a site here in green, you define zones around them, here named 1, 2 and 3. And then for each zone you essentially do a survey, or you look at the administrative data if they have that, but this is typically not something they record, right? But if you have, say, access to credit card data or bank card data, then you could actually do this exactly. But typically you interview people, so you set up those zones 1 to 5. You find out how many visits are there from each zone, 15,000 from zone 1, or 48,000 from zone 2, and so on and so forth. You of course want to know how many people are there in those zones, and that's given here as well. And then you want to figure out how much time and money did they spend on getting there. So that's £10 for people from zone 1 and £15 on average for people for zone 2, and you see that it gets more and more expensive as you get further out. You can define a visit rate. That's just the number of visits over the number of people who could have potentially visited, and that is the number of people in the zone. And then you can estimate a linear model using ordinary least squares, for instance. And if you would do that on this data, you would find that the relative number of visits from a zone is equal to 10.5 minus 0.3 times the cost of going there, right? So now essentially you have a demand curve. So what you can then do is say, what if you build a fence around this site and start charging for entrance? So in the first scenario it was essentially free, and now we charge an entrance fee. And that can be a fence and a gate. It can also be that you charge for parking or something like that, right? And then essentially what you need to do is to the travel cost, you need to add the entrance fee, £5, and then you use your statistical model that you estimated on the first bit of data to predict how the rate of the visit rate would change and how the visit numbers would change, right, by multiplying the rate by the number of people. Now what you see, if the price goes from 30 to 35, 34,000 visitors from zone 5 would drop to 0. And from zone 1, the number of visitors would drop from 15,000 to 12,000, right? Right, so I should have shown this before. So that's what you do, and then you have your visitor numbers. You essentially have a demand curve, and you can calculate the consumer surplus, right, by just taking the area under the curve. So that is something you can do. You make all sorts of assumptions, right? You assume a relationship. In this case, I assumed a linear relationship. I used OLS to estimate this. This is a bit silly because it sends the data because there's no negative numbers, right? So you should have used a Tobit. Okay, that was the zonal cost method, right? So it's relatively straightforward to do. And in next week's seminar, we're actually going to do it, if I'm not mistaken. And that's the best way of learning these sort of things. You can also, if you're brave, look at individual data, where you need much more detail. What you can do is in your survey of visitors, you can just not group people by where they come from, but you can actually group them in groups of 1 and look at everyone individually. That requires more data, that probably requires a geographic information system, but there is no reason not to do that anymore. It's just more data demanding, your computations will be more intensive. You can then also include socioeconomic characteristics in the model, right? Whereas the zonal, you sort of have people, right? But if you look at individual, you can see whether the willingness to pay for women is different than for men, unlikely in most cases. But you can look at whether income matters, and it probably does. You can look at whether age matters, and depending on the type of recreation, some things attract young people, some things attract older people, some things attract families, and you can have a much richer variation there. And the good thing about this is not so much that you find that different people are different, but that it's much better for predicting, right? If the makeup of the population that you're serving is changing, then the values would change as well, right? So your predictive power simply goes up. But in principle, it's just the same. It's just zones with one person in each zone. The limitation of the travel cost method is first, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, is we looked at the demand for a single site. What sort of nonsense is that, right? We looked at Brighton Beach as if it's the only beach in England. That's not true. There's other beaches. There's actually other beaches very close to Brighton Beach. So losing Brighton Beach, well, you go a few miles north, or no, a few miles east or a few miles west, and you find other beaches, right? So clearly there's close substitutes nearby, and completely ignore that, right? So simply as an economic model, this is just a bit silly. I'll talk a little bit about it in a moment. If you're looking at a single site, then you have a single site. You can say nothing about the quality of the site. The beach may be contaminated with oil or with sewage, more likely, in this part of the world. You cannot say anything. You know that there's a beach and there's water, but you cannot say anything about the relative value of shingle versus sand on the beach. So those things are simply hard to do if you're looking at a single site. A problem in here always is what is the opportunity cost of time. In the little derivation I did, I just assumed that the opportunity cost of time is equal to the wage rate, right? Which is true if you have a perfect labor market and non-lumpy labor supply. That is, it is not true. Non-use values cannot be done in there. And of course, multi-purpose trips is difficult as well, right? I talked about the Australian on Brighton Beach who did not come to the UK to visit Brighton Beach, right? But came there for a different purpose, so you should be careful in attributing the travel cost. But also, if you were to go to see the Great Barrier Reef, and you fly all the way to Australia, you would be quite mad to just go to the Great Barrier Reef, right? You would also want to see Canberra and Sydney and Adelaide and those places, because they're actually great places to visit too. And then the question becomes, of that £3,000 round trip and those 48 hours in the plane, which share of that money and time was for the Great Barrier Reef, and which one was for, which part was for the Sydney Opera House? And that is a very difficult determination to make. And of course there's a difference in travel and travel, right? If you go to the beach on a hot day in a crowded train, yes, that is a real cost, right? Because it's very unpleasant. If you go to the beach in an open-top car with three good friends, then the trip is not really a cost, right? and it actually becomes the trip is part of the fun. So you need to be very, very careful in how you interpret these things, or if you cannot be, because the data won't allow you to, you need to be, you introduce heterogeneity and noise in your estimates, right? Multiple sites. So what can you do with random utility models? This is not the limitation of random utility models. Oh no, so some of them, these are the limitations of random utility models. Site quality can be brought into play with these models, and substitutes can be brought into play with these type of models. So essentially what you do is, rather than looking at one particular site, you look at travel to multiple sites. And what you know is that a particular individual you observe chooses to go to site G, and by implication did not go to sites 1, 2, 3, all the way up to J, where J is not G, right? They did not go to all the other sites. And then what you can sort of deduce from that is that they must have liked site G better than its substitutes, than its alternatives. And that implies that the utility this particular person derived from this is better than the other one. And then what you do is use, and that's why it's called random utility models. This is one of those names where, I mean, economists are so very good at giving names to things that instead of clarify, just confuse people, right? Then what we assume in the econometrics is that there is sort of an intrinsic value and a fixed value to the utility of this particular site, and then there's random variation around that value. So we split this utility U that you see here, and we know that Uij must be greater than Uij for all other J's. We split that U into two parts, a fixed part V and a stochastic part epsilon, and the condition that you see here, that Ug must be greater than Uj, now becomes V plus epsilon of G must be greater than V plus epsilon of J. So that is what you assume. And then you can make a model, in this case a linear model of V, right? Can be income can get in there, travel cost can go in there, site quality can go in there, and so on and so forth. For the epsilon, you assume that it follows a Gumbel distribution, and you may wonder why. Very simple. If you assume something different than a Gumbel distribution, you can't solve the equations, right? It's nothing to do with data fitting or anything. This is what McFadden sorted out a long time ago, that if you assume this Gumbel distribution, the mathematics are nice. If you assume something else, the mathematics are not nice. And then you estimate the whole thing with a conditional logic, right, where you sort of have these observations. Visited Brighton Beach, did not visit Lansing Beach, did not visit my geography at the moment is escaping me, right? What is the next beat up? But that is essentially your data set, right? And then you estimate a logic model on that. You predict, you estimate the probabilities of going there. And then essentially you have a model that predicts visits to multiple sites while taking into account individual characteristics, while taking, if you do a mixed logic, while taking into account the site qualities and distance and so on and so forth. You can then predict the visits to those sites, and you again have sort of a demand curve, right? Because the attractive sites are visited a lot, and the not so attractive sites are visited little. And attractiveness has to do with the cost of getting there, as well as with the characteristics of the site, right? And then you can use that demand curve to look at changes in the consumer surplus, if you change the quality of the site, or you change the entrance fee or the cost of getting there. You can even remove a site. George is very optimistic here, and you can't actually add a site because you have no data over the site that wasn't there, right? So you can sort of add a hypothetical site and sort of assume what its qualities are and assume where its location is, and then you can sort of predict what is going on, but then it becomes pure extrapolation, right? The one issue with this particular model is that it models where people go conditional on the fact that they are going. You don't actually model how many trips they take. So that is an issue. Typically in applications, people also don't really look at intertemporal budgets. And if, for instance, you are fond of visiting gardens, then this week you may say, let's go to Wakehurst. But then next week you say, well, I've just been to Wakehurst, let's go somewhere else. And really, people don't make these decisions independent of each other, but you sort of had a list of things you'd like to visit. And what you did last weekend determines your choices of what you're going to do this weekend. Because presumably you don't like to do the same thing every weekend, right? Some people do, but most people like diversity, right? And that is often difficult to bring in. And of course, if we estimate these models, then we assume independence of irrelevant alternatives, right? And you may have got this with econometrics already, that are returning to our gardens. The relative probabilities of visiting Wakehurst or Sheffield is independent of the question whether or not you know about Standard, right? That other big garden that is relatively near. So that said, let's look at an application here where we're going to visit some lions in KwaZulu-Natal. That is in South Africa, and it's a study from 2002. You're looking at a map of South Africa, and then KwaZulu-Natal province. There's 4 different parks. There's actually a lot of different parks. There's cities near, and so on and so forth. The issue with wildlife is that they're sort of active at dusk and dawn, right? Midday they tend to sleep, in the middle of the night they also tend to rest. So if you want to see big game, you need to be there very early in the morning and sort of late in the afternoon, which immediately implies that you have to spend the night there, because these places also tend to be far away from where people live, right? So you can't just get up in the morning and drive there, then you arrive way too late, or you would not be able to drive back. So, how much welfare is derived from access to this park? How might this change with different management decisions? That's sort of questions. You might ask yourself, how will revenues change in response to changes in pricing? So, in this particular study, what they did, first you begin by saying, well, this is my choice set. This is the stuff that people can pick from. And that is these 4 parks. And they are different. There's different species that you could see there. And some have a more luxurious hotel near or in the park, and others have a fairly basic accommodation. You want to identify who is going there, and in this case they decided to restrict the sample to the locals, right? They were not so much interested in what Europeans are willing to pay to see these animals, but they were interested to see what South Africans were willing to pay. Good thing about sort of having overnight stays is that you have administrative data. The hotels know the booking, right? And they would have credit card details and they would know where people come from. And often if you go into a hotel that follows the rules, you need to fill out this form that tells you where you're from, right? And often also how you got there. So you have relatively detailed data. And you would know who they traveled with, that is important, how they stayed there, how much they paid for the hotel as well as for the entry fee, and so on and so forth. And then you can use the GIS, Geographic Information System, to sort of like figure out where they were, where they came from, where they are, and sort of figure out their travel cost. And that's often what is done in these studies, right? The travel costs are estimated. You know somebody lives in Hove and visited Brighton Beach, and that means that there is a sort of distance as the crow flies, which is easy to estimate, but nowadays you can also do sort of like distance, shortest distance over the road, or shortest distance with public transport, right? All these things can be looked up thanks to Google and other companies. And can figure out how much they spend on fuel and so on and so forth. You can add all these things up. And then you can come up with a consumer surplus, right? You've essentially estimated the welfare or the demand function. You can integrate under the demand function to have consumer surplus. In this case, the assumption the total annual welfare loss is essentially what happens if we close these parks to the locals and reserve them for Europeans, right, who are willing to pay much more. What would be the welfare loss of this? And what you see is that these are relatively sizable numbers. So per trip, consumer surplus varies somewhere between $18 per person per trip to $50 per person per trip. And for your average person in KwaZulu-Natal, that is a reasonable sum of money. Okay? So, final method, hedonic pricing. I believe this is Dorchester, but I'm not 100% sure. Well, it's somewhere to our west, and it's definitely in the south of England. So what do you do in a hedonic pricing study? That is what I said earlier. Essentially, you buy a bundle of goods. And if you buy a house, you don't just buy the number of bedrooms and the number of bathrooms, but you also buy, is there parking near? Are there planes flying over making lots of noise? You also buy access to schools, because England works sort of with this loose school districting system, right? So if you have children, you need to be careful where you live, because that determines where your children will go to school. And in this case, you also pay for a house that sits near a canal. And that may be something you like, because you like water. It may also be something that you dislike, because you don't like mosquitoes and the smell that comes from relatively still standing water in summer, right? And then this is also a fairly popular tourist place, so you're not just buying the house and the water and a nice view, but you're also buying the tourists that are clogging the roads, right? That all comes with this particular property. And some of these things are good, some of these things are bad, some of these things are good to some people and bad to other people. So what do you want to do is estimate the price of the house as a function of all the characteristics of the house. The characteristics of the building, but also the characteristics of its surroundings, right? That's essentially what you want to do. And then you have this function, and environmental quality is one of your attributes in this function. It's one of the Q's, and that means that you can manipulate that Q and see what would this do to the price of the house. So on the regressions that go in here, on the left hand side you have the price of the sale, and then on the right hand side you have a range of environmental characteristics, noise, air quality, and so on and so forth. Of course you need to have the characteristics of the house as well. How big is it? How old is it? How well maintained is it? You need to know other things. Is it near a bus stop? Is it near a shopping center? You need to know things about the neighborhood. What are the crime rates? What are the schools like? And so on and so forth. And then of course this is a market, right? So the price of an individual house goes up and down with the entire market. So you also need to control for that. And you need to do this because, I mean, the very basic idea of hedonic pricing is simple. If you take a nice house, or if you take a house that sits in a nice environment, and you compare it with the exact same house that sits in an ugly environment, what you will find is that people are prepared to pay more for the house that sits in a nice environment. But you can't stop there, because builders aren't stupid and they build different houses in different places. And what you would typically see, that in nice environments you have nicer houses, and in environments where nobody wants to live, they've put different houses there, smaller houses, less well maintained houses, and so on and so forth. So you can't just compare on environmental characteristics. You need to control for everything else, because those things correlate with environmental quality as well. So that's why you need to use multiple regression, right? And often this is done spatially. Geographic information systems come into play. Okay, two of these maps I understand. And two of these maps I don't understand. That is the total noise map. This is the noise map from Heathrow, right? That's pretty obvious. The blue one is a road map. And what I think we're looking at is air quality. The air pollution that is caused by the traffic on this road. That is what I think the blue map is, where the darker the color, the more pristine the air. But don't quote me on that. And then this map here, and again we're in London, because you can see the Thames, must have to do with what sort of area is this, where I think the red is agriculture and the green is sort of nature, parks, right, not wild nature. This is London, and the black is housing, and the grey may be industrial, right? Something like that, and all that needs to go into your model, right? So what do? You estimate your hedonic price function, and then you can manipulate that function and integrate under it to find the consumer surplus. So let's look at an example. So what we have here is not the hedonic price of the house. No, it is the hedonic price of the house. It's the log of the sale price as a function of the date of the sale, the age of the house, the size of the house, the number of bathrooms, whether it has a pool, must be data from California, and the number of fireplaces it has, the crime rate in the neighborhood, the school quality, ethnic composition, right? how black are your neighbors. This is US data, and that matters. How densely populated is the area. And then the variables you may be interested in, like the distance to the beach. Now what you see is that the further away from the beach, the lower the price of the house. Highly significant, right? And then here we have variables that measure air quality. So total suspended particles, again highly significant, or nitrogen dioxide. Not nitrous, nitrogen. And again, that is highly significant, and the higher the concentration of these things that make you ill, the lower the price of the house. So now you know the relationship between the sale price of the house and the environmental quality, the air quality, and then you can sort of like, what would the price of the house be if this were close to zero? Or if it were to double, what would change? And then you have your changes along the demand curve, and you have your consumer surplus, right? There's a number of assumptions that go in here, right? You assume that your buyers know what they're buying. And if you guys know about renting houses, right? You go and inspect them, and you look at the bathroom and so on and so forth. That is sort of the information that you have, but typically you don't know much about the quality of the air in the apartment that you rent, or in the room that you rent. Whereas the assumption here is that people do, and people do make informed decisions about these things. Now, if we're talking about the market for buying houses rather than for renting rooms, people are presumably better informed and make those decisions taking these characteristics into account. But that is not necessarily the case. If you buy a house in the UK, they sort of like give you like this huge folder about all the things that are in or near your house. But the assumption there is that people actually read through this material, right? So if people sort of translate, say, the flood risk incorrectly, then you don't measure flood risk as the objective flood risk, but you measure how people interpret that information, right? We also assume that the market is in equilibrium. And one of the things that you may have wondered about, when you see this hedonic price function, there's no characteristics of the buyer, there's no characteristics of the seller, right? That's a bit peculiar at first sight, but that follows from the fact that we assume that it's in equilibrium. Because if you somehow have a different valuation of this house than other buyers in the market, you have a lower valuation of this house, then you're out of the market, right? What matters here is the highest bidder, rather than the individual that is there, right? But the assumption is that we aggregate preferences through the market. And the demand function that is valid is not the demand of the individual that happened to have bought the house, but because there's competition for buying these houses, what matters is the characteristics of the pool of potential buyers rather than the characteristics of the individual buyer. And that is why you would never see individual characteristics in an hedonic price function. So that is an assumption that we make. And this is true if the market is thick, but if the market is thin, that may not be the case. And of course we assume in this case a log linear specification. Good thing about hedonic pricing is that data are easy to get, relatively reliable. There's sometimes an issue that what you find is the asking price rather than the sale price. Asking prices are generally easier to get than sale prices. Weaknesses are, it's the stuff that affects house prices. That's what you can value. Anything that you may care about in the environment that is out there but does not affect the housing price, you can't deal with, right? Talked about essentially what you model here is not so much the objective characteristics of the environment, but the subjective characteristics of the environment. And what we see happening in the US at the moment, for instance, or what we have seen happening in the US at the moment, for instance, is that houses near the shore have seen a fairly steep drop in value, which some people interpret as the housing market is beginning to realize that the level of the sea is rising and that these houses may not be there in a distant future. But it seems to be that the market is exaggerating this signal and the house price drop is steeper than what you would think the actual risk to these properties are. So thank you, Greta, for getting onto the property ladder easier, right? The other complication is, and that's a particularly serious one, is that environmental characteristics do not just affect house prices, they also affect wages. So I talked about hedonic price regressions, but there's also hedonic wage regressions. And what you would see in the market is that people who are sent out to work or who accept a job in a nice environment are prepared to accept a lower salary than people who work in a harsh environment. And a scenario you can imagine is that you go on the job market in a year's time, a bit less, and somebody offers you a job in Paris, and you think, great, right, Paris, and you don't even stop to ask for what sort of salary would I get. But it may also be that somebody offers you a job in Aberdeen or even in Murmansk. And then you would stop and say, okay, what does this pay, and would I really want to live there, and does the salary compensate for it, right? So yes, the characteristics of the location of the job that you get offered determine what sort of salary you would demand. There's been many hedonic wage studies that indeed show that in places with low crime, in places with a lot of sunshine, people accept a lower wage. Perhaps that is not how you want to think about it, but you can also turn it around in places where the weather is shite and the crime rate is high. People demand a higher wage to compensate for the disutility of living there. Now, you may say, well, that's just another piece of information. The problem is, of course, that house prices determine wages, and wages determine house prices, right? This is a simultaneous market. Everything influences everything. So if you're going to run a proper hedonic house price regression, then you should also at the same time run hedonic wage regression and use wage and house prices as simultaneous variables, right? Which makes the econometrics a good bit more complicated than you care to know. So, one final case study to conclude today. We're going to look at English nature and the total amenity value, and essentially the question is, what is the value of living in or near desirable natural areas? And this is a study by Gibbons a few years ago, and it was done on behalf of the UK government. And it looks at a whole range of things: amenities, sports, cultural heritage, health, education, leisure, and inspiration. So they had a database of 1 million house transactions, and the source of the data was nationwide. So this is the mortgages, right? The good thing is that it's a lot of data. The bad thing is that not every house has a mortgage, right? So you exclude particular parts of the market. The values that went in were not so much the mortgage values, which is of course typically a fraction of the house price, but of course in the records that go in there, the actual sales price is included, as well as a lot of other characteristics of the house, but not as detailed as you would get from a real estate agent. But it does have the exact location, well, the full postcode, which is relatively exact. And then they just ran the regression, right? And here are some of the results. Oh no, this is one of the inputs. Sorry. So this is land type, right? So in brown, for instance, you have the arable lands. In green, you have the pasture lands. In blue, up there, you have mountains. In black, you have the cities. In dark blue, you have the waters, and so on and so forth, right? So this is the landscape of the United Kingdom, right? Northern Ireland is there as well. Then you have maps of the national parks, right? Here, no, here this is the South Downs National Park, the areas of outstanding natural beauty, and so on and so forth. They are there, and then you run a regression of the house prices on these things, and you find such things as British people are prepared to pay 377 more for a house if it's close to broadleaf woodland, but only £227 more if it's close to coniferous woodland, right? So we like our broadleaf trees, right, because they turn nice and coloredy in fall, right? Is one interpretation. Another interpretation that comes out of a different study, not this one, is that people like the trees that are not that are less abundant, right? They like their rare trees. And if you live in an area where there's a lot of coniferous woodland, you like your broadleaves. And if you live in an area with a lot of broadleaves, you actually like your coniferous trees. But this is what comes out of the study. Also, intriguingly, domestic gardens, people like much better than nature, right? That's £2,000 versus £400, right? And that's because there's a lot more color, it's typically better maintained, and so on and so forth. People also like living near water, no surprises there. If you, and that was the other, that was this one, right? That's the green belt, the middle one. If you live in a national park, then your house increases its value by £10,000, right? You would think, great, but of course you can't build in national parks anymore. So this is something that happened to you. This is not something that you can manipulate. It's not something that most of us have the power to declare a national park around us, right? So this just happens. Similarly, living in the green belt and knowing that there won't be a lot of new builds around you is worth around £6,000. And then living near a national trust is good, because the further away you get, your house price falls by £1,000 per kilometer. And I don't think this continues if you live 100 miles away from the national trust property. And then you can put all these things together, combine it with the information I showed you before, and then you can look at where, because of the natural environment, house prices are inflated in green, or deflated in red. And the scale, if you can't read, goes up to 83% positive in the very dark greens, and goes to minus 33% in the dark red. So yeah, we happen to be in a very pleasant place of, in this case, England, right? We don't know what happened to Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland in this map. So this tells you something about how the housing market appreciates the natural environment. So the worst place to be is in Northampton, and the best place to be is in Exmoor, or Dartmoor, or the Lake District, right? So this is very closely associated also where people like to take their holidays if they're in this country. So to sum up, we looked at revealed preferences, right? I talked about three methods: defensive expenditure, travel cost, and hedonic pricing. Looked at this type of behavior that we were looking at. I'm looking at purchases for stuff that replaces bad quality water or bad air, or mitigates its consequences. Look at travel costs, it's essentially entrance fee to go someplace that you like, or hedonic pricing, where you buy something and then you just happen to buy the environment with it, right? I also looked at some of the applications for recreational demand, for health, and for amenities and disamenities, right? So the big disadvantage of everything I've done today and everything I've shown you today is that it applies to direct and sometimes indirect, but mostly direct use values only. So next week I'm going to talk about two different sets of methods where we can estimate any value that we like, and that comes under the heading of stated preferences. Okay, I'll see you then.